You can redecorate the house after the funeral. Vanessa, I heard my daughter-in-law whisper in the kitchen, but don't touch Harold's study until we know where the inheritance papers are. My husband had been dead for less than 6 hours. I said nothing. I simply stood at the top of the staircase with one hand resting on the mahogany banister. Harold had polished himself every Christmas for 32 years, and for the first time since the hospital called that morning, I realized grief was not going to be the hardest part of losing my husband. The hardest part would be watching my family reveal who they truly were now that they believed he was gone. I'm Evelyn Carter. I'm 68 years old, and on the day my husband passed away, I kept quiet about the $28 million nobody knew I controlled. The rain had started before dawn that morning, soft against the windows of our Connecticut estate, the kind of cold April rain Harold used to call banker weather. He always said wealthy people made their biggest decisions on gloomy days because darkness made everyone nervous. By noon, our home was full of people carrying casseroles, sympathy flowers, and careful expressions. The scent of lilies drifted through every room. I hated lilies. Harold hated them too. But Vanessa had ordered 6 enormous arrangements before his body had even left the hospital. They look elegant, she said while directing the florist through the foyer as if she already owned the house. My son Daniel stood beside her in silence, exhausted and pale in his black sweater, his eyes hollow from shock. At least, I wanted to believe it was shock. But every time Vanessa spoke, he nodded too quickly, too obediently, like a man already surrendering decisions he didn't realize were destroying him. You should rest, Evelyn, Vanessa told me softly when she noticed me standing near the fireplace. Her voice carried that polished kindness wealthy women practice in country clubs and charity galas. Daniel and I can handle everything from here. From here. Such a small phrase. Yet I noticed it immediately. Not help you. Not support you. Handle everything. As if Harold's death had quietly transferred authority to them before the funeral arrangements had even been finalized. I looked toward Harold's study at the end of the hallway. The door remained closed. Behind it sat the locked cabinet containing documents no one else knew existed. Not Daniel. Not Vanessa. Not even our family accountant. 6 months earlier, Harold had sat beside me in that very room, wearing his reading glasses low on his nose while rain tapped against the windows exactly like today. If anything happens to me, he told me quietly, promise me you won't trust anyone too quickly, especially when money starts making people nervous. At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious. Harold had spent 40 years building Carter Biotech from a struggling laboratory startup into one of the most respected pharmaceutical companies in New England. Wealth made him careful, but never paranoid. At least, that's what I believed before I saw Vanessa smiling in my kitchen while discussing renovation plans before my husband's body had even returned home. That evening, after most guests finally left, I walked upstairs to our bedroom alone. Harold's navy robe still hung behind the bathroom door. His watch rested on the nightstand beside a half-finished mystery novel he would never complete. I sat carefully on the edge of our bed and stared at the silence surrounding me. Downstairs, I heard Vanessa laugh softly while speaking to Daniel. Then I heard something else. Once probate is finished, she whispered, we can finally start making real decisions. I closed my eyes slowly. They thought they were waiting for Harold's money. They had no idea Harold had spent the last year preparing for them. The morning after Harold died, I woke before sunrise to the sound of footsteps moving across the hallway outside our bedroom. For a few seconds, trapped between sleep and reality, I thought it was him. Harold always woke early. He would shuffle downstairs in his slippers, start the coffee maker, and stand by the kitchen windows watching the grounds behind the estate while reading financial reports on his tablet. Sometimes I would stay in bed just to listen to those quiet sounds because they made the house feel safe. But this time the footsteps were sharper, faster, purposeful. I opened my eyes to cold gray light filtering through the curtains and remembered all over again that my husband was gone. I sat up slowly, wrapping my robe tighter around myself against the chill. The bedroom felt strangely untouched by grief. Harold's glasses still rested beside the lamp. His navy cardigan remained folded neatly over the leather chair near the fireplace. Even the faint scent of his cedarwood cologne lingered in the air. It felt less like death and more like absence, like he had stepped out briefly and forgotten to come home. Downstairs, cabinet doors opened and closed. I checked the clock on the nightstand. 6:15 in the morning. Too early for visitors. Too early for normal conversation. When I reached the kitchen, Vanessa stood near the marble island holding a yellow legal pad in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. She had changed completely overnight. Yesterday, she wore soft sweaters and practiced sympathy. This morning, she looked polished and alert in cream slacks and gold jewelry, her blonde hair tied neatly back as if she were preparing for a business meeting instead of a funeral. "You are up early," she said pleasantly when she noticed me. I nodded and walked toward the coffee maker without answering. Daniel sat at the far end of the kitchen table, staring at his phone. He barely looked up when I entered. "I was just telling Daniel we need to stay organized over the next few weeks," Vanessa continued smoothly. "There are insurance documents, property evaluations, shareholder notifications. Harold handled so much personally." I poured myself coffee slowly. My hands remained steady, though something deep inside me had started hardening overnight. Vanessa slid the legal pad slightly across the counter. At the top of the page, I saw categories written in careful handwriting. Properties, accounts, investments, household transfers. Beneath that, another line caught my attention immediately. Office access and study inventory. I lifted my eyes toward her. She smiled warmly. Too warmly. "I figured we should start listing everything before it becomes overwhelming," she said, "especially with probate coming." Probate. Another small word that revealed too much. Harold had not even been buried yet. Daniel finally cleared his throat. "Mom, Vanessa is only trying to help." I looked at my son carefully then. His shoulders seemed heavier than yesterday. Dark circles had formed beneath his eyes. He looked exhausted, but underneath the exhaustion I noticed something else. Fear. Not grief. Fear. It sat quietly behind his expression like a shadow he could not hide. "Of course," I said softly. "Organization is important." Vanessa relaxed slightly after hearing that. She thought cooperation meant weakness. Harold used to say that about people like her. They mistake silence for surrender because they cannot imagine restraint as power. As I carried my coffee toward the sunroom, I noticed the framed family photographs lining the hallway had already been rearranged. Several older pictures of Harold and me were missing entirely. In their place sat newer photographs of Daniel and Vanessa from charity galas and beach vacations. I stopped walking, just for a moment. Then I continued into the sunroom without saying a word. Outside, rain still covered the windows in silver streaks. The estate grounds stretched beyond the terrace, empty and quiet beneath the cloudy Connecticut sky. Harold planted every maple tree himself during the first years we lived there. He once told me he wanted the property to outlive us both. I sat down in his favorite chair and stared across the lawn while the house slowly filled with the sounds of people preparing to divide a life that had not even finished mourning yet. Then my phone vibrated quietly beside me. One message. One sentence. From Martin Hale. "Do not let anyone enter Harold's study until I arrive." Martin Hale arrived precisely at 9:05 that morning carrying a black leather briefcase and wearing the same charcoal overcoat he had worn to every major Carter family event for nearly 20 years. He had been Harold's attorney since before Carter Biotech became successful, back when our entire company operated out of a rented office above a hardware store in Hartford. Harold trusted very few people completely, but Martin was one of them. When the front door opened, Vanessa immediately appeared in the foyer with a smile, so polished it almost looked rehearsed. "Martin," she said warmly, extending both hands toward him. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." Martin nodded politely, but did not take her hands. His pale blue eyes moved past her immediately and settled on me, standing near the staircase. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "I need a private word with you." The air in the foyer changed instantly. Vanessa's smile tightened almost invisibly. Daniel looked up from the living room sofa where he had been pretending to read condolence messages on his phone. "Anything you need to discuss can be discussed openly," Vanessa replied before I could answer. "We are all family here." Martin removed his gloves slowly. "This conversation concerns legal instructions Harold left specifically for Mrs. Carter." For one brief second, I saw something cold flash behind Vanessa's eyes. Not sadness, not irritation, calculation. She stepped aside without another word, but I noticed the way her fingers tightened around the railing as Martin and I walked toward the study. The moment the heavy oak door closed behind us, the house suddenly felt quieter, safer. Harold's study still smelled faintly of coffee, cedarwood, and old paper. Sunlight filtered weakly through the rain clouds outside, casting pale gray shadows across the shelves lined with financial journals and framed photographs from company award dinners. Martin set his briefcase carefully on Harold's desk and looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "Did anyone enter this room after Harold passed?" he asked. "Not yet," I answered. "Vanessa has been trying." Martin nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already suspected. Then he unlocked the briefcase and removed a thick manila envelope stamped with Harold's handwriting. My chest tightened immediately when I saw it. Harold always wrote in dark blue fountain pen ink, precise and sharp, like every word mattered. Across the front were 4 simple words: "For Evelyn only." Harold instructed me to deliver this personally if anything happened to him. Martin said quietly. He was very clear about that. I sat slowly in Harold's leather chair while Martin handed me the envelope. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Inside were several documents, a silver safety deposit key, and a handwritten letter folded neatly in half. My hands hesitated for the first time since Harold died. Martin looked away respectfully while I opened the letter. "Evelyn, if you are reading this, it means Vanessa moved faster than I hoped she would." I stopped breathing for a moment. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the silence inside the study grew heavier with every word. I continued reading. "Daniel does not see her clearly yet. He thinks ambition is the same thing as intelligence. It is not. Over the past year, I uncovered financial transfers that should never have happened. Company funds were moved through accounts connected to Vanessa's consulting firm. I wanted to confront Daniel, but I knew he would warn her before I could prove everything. So I prepared another way." My eyes lifted slowly toward Martin. "Harold knew?" I whispered. Martin gave a grim nod. "For almost a year." I looked back down at the letter. There was one final paragraph written more heavily than the rest, as though Harold had pressed harder with the pen while writing it. "The trust remains untouched unless you activate it personally. $28 million, Evelyn. Every document, every account, every controlling share. They will believe they inherited security. Do not tell them otherwise until you know exactly who they have become." After Martin left that afternoon, I remained alone in Harold's study for nearly an hour with the letter resting in my lap and the rain still sliding down the windows in soft gray lines. The house outside the door sounded distant now. Muffled voices, footsteps, cabinet doors closing downstairs. It reminded me of being trapped underwater while the world continued moving above the surface. I read Harold's letter 3 more times before finally folding it carefully and placing it back inside the envelope. What unsettled me most was not the money. Harold and I had lived around wealth for decades. Expensive things stopped feeling important after enough years. What unsettled me was the realization that my husband had spent his final months quietly preparing for betrayal inside his own family. And somehow, I had missed it. Or maybe I had chosen not to see it. As I sat there staring at the bookshelves, memories began returning differently now, rearranging themselves into something colder and sharper than nostalgia. Last Thanksgiving, Vanessa insisted on hosting dinner herself for the first time. She smiled constantly that evening, refilling wine glasses before they were empty, complimenting everyone with perfect social grace. But halfway through dessert, I remembered noticing Harold become unusually quiet when Vanessa started asking detailed questions about the company's board structure. "If something ever happened unexpectedly," she asked casually while cutting pecan pie, "would Daniel automatically inherit your voting shares?" At the time, I thought it was an awkward financial question from an ambitious woman trying too hard to sound intelligent. Harold answered carefully without giving specifics, then changed the subject almost immediately. Later that night, after guests left, I found him standing alone in the kitchen staring out into the snow-covered backyard. "Do you trust her?" he asked suddenly. I remember laughing softly because the question felt so strange. "Vanessa?" I replied. "She is family." Harold never answered directly. He only took a slow sip of bourbon and said, "Sometimes people confuse access with entitlement." Another memory surfaced after that. 3 months earlier, during a charity fundraiser in Boston, I walked into the hotel ballroom unexpectedly early and found Vanessa speaking with one of Carter Biotech's junior financial analysts near the bar. The conversation stopped the moment they saw me. Vanessa recovered quickly, smiling as always. "We were just talking about market projections," she explained lightly. The analyst looked nervous enough to spill his drink. I forgot about it by the next morning. Now I understood why Harold had started reviewing company transfers personally every weekend. Why he began locking documents inside his study instead of leaving them at the office. Why he changed passwords, even from Daniel. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Before I could answer, the door opened slightly, and Daniel stepped inside. He looked exhausted again, though this time there was tension beneath his grief. "Mom," he said quietly, "Vanessa is worried about you being alone up here all day." I almost smiled at that. Vanessa was not worried about me. Vanessa was worried about what might be inside this room. "I am fine," I answered calmly. Daniel shifted awkwardly near the doorway. He looked so much like Harold at that age that for a brief second my chest tightened painfully. Same broad shoulders. Same tired eyes when stressed. But Harold had always possessed a steadiness Daniel never fully developed. Daniel wanted peace too badly. That weakness made him easy to lead. "Vanessa thinks we should start discussing long-term plans for the estate soon," he continued carefully. "Just practical things." There it was again. Practical. Every cruel decision wealthy people make eventually hides behind that word. I folded Harold's letter deeper inside the envelope before standing slowly from the desk. "Your father has not even been buried yet," I said softly. Daniel looked away immediately. Guilt crossed his face so quickly it almost disappeared before I caught it. Almost. Then his eyes drifted toward the locked cabinet behind Harold's desk. Just for a second. But it was enough. Enough for me to understand something terrible. Daniel already knew there was more money somewhere. He just did not know where. The funeral took place 2 days later beneath a sky so pale it almost looked white. Connecticut in early spring always carried that strange in-between feeling, where winter had technically ended but warmth still felt far away. The cemetery grounds were damp from days of rain, and soft mud clung to the edges of polished black shoes as mourners gathered beneath rows of bare maple trees. Harold would have hated the weather. He always said funerals should happen under sunlight, because grief already carried enough darkness on its own. I stood beside Daniel near the front while the minister spoke quietly about legacy, integrity, and family devotion. Words people always use when someone powerful dies. Vanessa remained close to my son the entire service, one hand resting gently on his arm, as if she were holding him together for the world to admire. Her black coat fit perfectly. Even her grief looked curated. Every few minutes, she glanced toward the line of executives gathered near the back of the crowd. Board members, investors, attorneys, men who spent decades respecting Harold because he built an empire without ever raising his voice. They nodded solemnly whenever Vanessa looked their way, and I realized she was already positioning herself among them, not as a widow by marriage, as a future authority. After the burial, guests returned to the estate for the reception. The dining room filled with low conversations, expensive perfume, and the clinking of crystal glasses against silver trays. Caterers moved silently between guests carrying miniature crab cakes and champagne nobody really wanted. I wandered through the crowd slowly, hearing fragments of conversation stop whenever I approached. Daniel will probably step into leadership naturally. Vanessa has remarkable business instincts. The company will need stability during transition. Transition. Another careful word. Wealthy people rarely speak directly about death. They speak about transition, continuity, structure. It makes greed sound respectable. Near the fireplace, I noticed Vanessa laughing softly beside Richard Ellison, one of Carter Biotech's senior board members. Richard had worked with Harold for over 20 years. He looked uncomfortable while Vanessa spoke to him, but he smiled politely anyway. "The company needs modern leadership now," I overheard her saying as I passed nearby. Harold respected tradition too much sometimes. I kept walking without reacting, but inside me, something shifted colder. Harold's body had barely reached the ground, and she was already reshaping his legacy into an obstacle she planned to overcome. Later that evening, after most guests left, I finally escaped to the back terrace alone. The air smelled like wet earth and cigarette smoke drifting faintly from somewhere beyond the garden. Tiny drops of rain still clung to the iron railings. I wrapped my coat tighter around myself and stared across the dark lawn where Harold used to host summer charity dinners beneath strings of white lights. "Grandma." I turned slightly at the sound of the voice behind me. Sophie stood quietly near the doorway, her long brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail, still wearing the simple black dress from the funeral. At 19, she had inherited Harold's observant eyes. She noticed things other people missed. "You disappeared," she said softly. "I wanted to make sure you were okay." I smiled faintly for the first time in days. I needed some air. Sophie hesitated before stepping closer. Then she lowered her voice carefully. "Grandma, I think Dad and Vanessa are looking for something." My chest tightened immediately, though I kept my expression calm. "What makes you say that?" Sophie glanced nervously back toward the house before answering. "Last night, I heard Vanessa arguing with Dad in the kitchen after you went upstairs. She kept saying your grandfather must have hidden documents somewhere before he died. Dad told her to stop talking about it until after the funeral." The rain tapped softly against the terrace roof above us. I said nothing. Sophie looked at me carefully then, almost studying my face. "Grandma," she whispered, "did Grandpa know something before he died?" I looked past her toward the glowing windows of the estate, where silhouettes moved room to room like strangers inside my own home. Then I thought about Harold's letter hidden upstairs in my bedroom drawer, and the $28 million nobody realized still belonged entirely to me. "Yes," I answered quietly. "I think he did." The house became quieter after the funeral, but it was not the peaceful kind of quiet Harold and I once enjoyed together. This silence felt watchful, careful. Every conversation stopped a second too early whenever I entered a room. Every drawer seemed slightly out of place after I left it unattended. Even the staff noticed it. Martha, our housekeeper of 14 years, stopped making eye contact whenever Vanessa gave instructions in front of me. On Sunday morning, I walked downstairs expecting the familiar smell of coffee and cinnamon toast Harold used to make for Sophie during her weekend visits. Instead, I found Vanessa sitting alone at the kitchen island surrounded by folders and spreadsheets spread neatly across the marble counter. Sunlight streamed through the windows behind her, catching the gold bracelet on her wrist as she flipped through pages with practiced confidence. "Good morning," she said pleasantly without looking up. "I hope you slept better." I poured myself coffee slowly. "As well as can be expected." Vanessa nodded sympathetically, though her attention never fully left the paperwork in front of her. "Daniel is meeting with several company advisors later today," she explained. "There are so many financial responsibilities to handle now. It is honestly overwhelming." I glanced toward the papers. Property assessments, tax projections, investment summaries. None of them were the real documents she wanted. "Your father-in-law managed those responsibilities for 40 years, I replied calmly. "I am sure another week will not destroy the company." Vanessa smiled faintly at that. "Of course not. But uncertainty makes investors nervous." There it was again. Investors, shares, structures, everything except grief. She finally looked up at me fully then, studying my face with careful curiosity. "Daniel mentioned you spent a long time in Harold's study with Martin the other day." I stirred cream into my coffee without reacting. "Martin handled legal matters for your father-in-law for decades." "Naturally," she said softly. "I suppose Harold kept certain documents there?" I met her eyes for the first time that morning. Blue, perfectly composed, empty as polished glass. "Your father-in-law kept many things private," I answered. Vanessa held my gaze a second longer than necessary before smiling again. "Well, transparency is important now. Families can become complicated after a death when information is hidden." Hidden. Such an interesting word choice. Before I could respond, Sophie entered the kitchen carrying her backpack over one shoulder. Her eyes moved quickly between Vanessa and me before settling on. The folders spread across the island. "Dad is looking for you," she said quietly to Vanessa. "Something about the Zurich accounts." The room went completely still. Vanessa's expression changed so quickly most people would have missed it. Just one sharp flicker behind the eyes before the smile returned. "Thank you, sweetheart," she replied lightly. But I noticed the way her fingers immediately closed the folder nearest to her. Zurich. Offshore accounts. My pulse remained calm, but inside my mind something clicked into place with terrible clarity. Harold's letter mentioned unauthorized transfers through consulting accounts. Switzerland would make sense for hiding movement quietly overseas. Vanessa gathered the folders quickly and stood from the island. "Excuse me, Evelyn," she said smoothly. "Business never seems to pause for grief." Then she disappeared down the hallway in expensive heels that clicked sharply against hardwood floors. Sophie waited until she was gone before lowering her voice. "Grandma," she whispered nervously. "I was not supposed to hear this, but Dad and Vanessa argued last night about passwords. She kept saying your grandfather changed access to several accounts before he died. I stared into my untouched coffee. Steam curled slowly into the air between us. Harold had not simply protected money. He had moved pieces across the board before anyone realized they were playing a game. Sophie, I asked carefully, has your father said anything else? She hesitated. Then she nodded once. He asked Vanessa if Grandpa ever suspected her. My fingers tightened slightly around the coffee cup. And what did she say? Sophie swallowed nervously before answering. She said suspicion does not matter if there is no proof. 3 days after the funeral, the estate no longer felt like my home. It felt like a company waiting for new management. Men in tailored suits arrived each morning carrying briefcases and laptops, disappearing into Harold's former office downstairs while Vanessa guided conversations with calm authority I had never officially given her. The dining room table where Harold and I once hosted Thanksgiving dinners had become covered in legal folders, market reports, and property evaluations. Every room carried the quiet pressure of people preparing for transition. I moved through the house slowly now, almost like a guest. Martha still brought me tea every afternoon without needing to ask, but even she looked nervous whenever Vanessa entered a room. The staff understood something had shifted. They simply did not know how dangerous it might become. That Wednesday evening, Vanessa organized what she called a small family planning dinner. The phrase alone irritated me. Nothing about grief should sound like corporate scheduling. Still, I attended without complaint. The dining room glowed softly beneath the crystal chandelier Harold imported from Italy 20 years earlier. Candles flickered against polished silverware while rain tapped lightly against the windows again, as though the weather itself refused to move on from mourning. Daniel sat near the center of the table with his sleeves rolled halfway up his forearms, staring at financial projections spread beside his dinner plate instead of touching his food. Vanessa sat at his right wearing a cream silk blouse and pearl earrings Harold once gave me for our anniversary before she somehow convinced Daniel to borrow them for her several months ago. Sophie remained unusually quiet throughout dinner, occasionally glancing toward me with concern she was trying hard to hide. Halfway through the meal, Vanessa placed her wine glass down carefully and folded her hands together. I think we need to start discussing long-term living arrangements, she said gently. The room became still immediately. Even the staff pouring wine seemed to pause. Daniel looked uncomfortable, but did not interrupt her. Vanessa continued speaking with perfect calm. This estate is enormous for one person to manage alone, especially after such a loss. Harold handled most operational details personally for years. I set my fork down quietly. I have lived in this house for 32 years. I replied evenly. I am familiar with how doors and light switches work. Sophie lowered her head suddenly, hiding what looked suspiciously like the beginning of a smile. Vanessa's expression tightened for only a second before softening again. That is not what I meant, she said smoothly. I am only concerned about your comfort. There are wonderful communities in Greenwich specifically designed for elegant retirement living. Full staff, privacy, medical support if needed. Medical support, retirement living. She was trying to remove me from my own home before Harold's side of the closet had even been emptied. Daniel finally spoke, though his voice lacked conviction. Mom, Vanessa just thinks you deserve less stress right now. I looked directly at my son then. Really looked at him. His exhaustion had deepened over the past week. Tiny lines now framed his mouth whenever Vanessa spoke about money or property. Harold used to say guilt always arrives physically before emotionally. And where exactly would you and Vanessa live if I left? I asked quietly. Daniel hesitated too long before answering. That silence told me everything. Vanessa rescued him immediately. The estate belongs to family, Evelyn, she said softly. Harold would want it properly maintained. Family. Such a convenient word when someone wants access to something expensive. Before I could respond, Sophie suddenly pushed her chair back from the table. Grandpa would want Grandma here, she said firmly. The room froze again. Vanessa turned toward her with practiced patience. Sweetheart, adults are having a complicated conversation. No, Sophie replied quietly. You are. Daniel looked mortified. Sophie, he warned sharply. But she stood anyway, her eyes moving from her father to Vanessa before finally settling on me. Grandpa told me something last summer, she said carefully. He said houses remember who protected them. Then she walked out of the dining room before anyone could stop her. Silence settled heavily over the table after she left. Vanessa picked up her wine glass again with perfectly steady fingers, but I noticed the faintest crack beginning to form beneath her composure for the first time. The next morning, I found Harold's study unlocked. I stopped in the hallway immediately, my pulse slowing instead of quickening. Fear makes people rush. Experience teaches you to. Become still first. The heavy oak door sat slightly open, letting a thin strip of morning light spill across the hardwood floor. I knew with absolute certainty I had locked it the night before. Slowly, I pushed the door wider and stepped inside. At first glance, everything appeared untouched. Harold's desk remained perfectly organized. The leather chair sat angled slightly toward the fireplace exactly as I left it. Even the framed photograph of Daniel graduating from Yale remained centered beside the lamp. But grief sharpens strange instincts. You begin noticing tiny things because loss has already taught you how quickly a life can disappear. One drawer near the desk hung open barely half an inch. Harold never left drawers open. Ever. I crossed the room quietly and pulled it fully open. Inside, several folders had been disturbed. Documents shifted slightly out of alignment. A yellow legal pad missing entirely. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Whoever searched the room understood discretion. My eyes moved toward the locked cabinet behind the desk. Still closed. Still secure. But now I knew for certain someone had entered this room looking for something specific. I heard footsteps approaching before I could close the drawer again. Vanessa appeared in the doorway carrying a tablet and wearing pale gray workout clothes as though she had just returned from a peaceful morning walk instead of secretly searching through a dead man's office. "Oh," she said lightly, pausing when she saw me. "I did not realize you were in here." Neither of us acknowledged the open drawer between us. "I could say the same thing," I replied calmly. Vanessa smiled with practiced ease. "I came looking for old board contact lists. Richard Ellison requested them before today's conference call." "Richard again. Interesting. Did you find them?" I asked. "Not yet." She leaned one shoulder casually against the doorway, studying me carefully. "You seem protective of this room." I closed the drawer gently before answering. "Your father-in-law built his entire life here. And now Daniel has to protect that legacy," she replied smoothly. "The company is vulnerable right now. Investors become nervous. During transitions. Again with transitions. Always transitions. Never mourning. Never family. Only leverage disguised as responsibility." Before I could respond, Sophie suddenly appeared behind Vanessa in the hallway. Her expression tightened the moment she saw us both standing inside Harold's study. "Dad is asking for you downstairs," she told Vanessa quietly. Vanessa's eyes lingered on me 1 second longer before she pushed away from the doorway. "Of course," she said pleasantly. Then she disappeared down the hall without another word. Sophie waited until the sound of heels faded downstairs before stepping into the study fully and closing the door behind her. "She has been coming up here every morning," Sophie whispered immediately. "Usually when you are having breakfast." I looked at her carefully. "How long have you known?" "Since before Grandpa died." Her voice dropped lower. "One night last month I heard Dad and Vanessa arguing. Dad kept saying they needed to stop pushing Grandpa about the accounts because he was getting suspicious." My chest tightened slowly. Harold had not imagined any of this. "Did your grandfather say anything to you directly?" I asked softly. Sophie hesitated before nodding once. "A few weeks ago he gave me a flash drive." She reached into the pocket of her sweater and pulled out a small silver drive no larger than her thumb. "He told me to hide it and only give it to you if something happened to him." The room suddenly felt colder. I stared at the tiny piece of metal resting in her palm while rain drifted softly against the windows outside again. Harold had prepared more carefully than I realized. Sophie stepped closer and lowered her voice further. "Grandma, I do not think Grandpa was afraid of losing money." I looked up at her. "What do you think he was afraid of?" Sophie swallowed hard before answering. "I think he was afraid of who Dad was becoming around Vanessa." That night, after everyone finally went upstairs, I sat alone in Harold's study with the flash drive resting beside his old brass desk lamp. The entire house had gone quiet except for the faint hum of rain against the windows and the occasional groan of old floorboards settling beneath years of weight. I stared at the tiny silver drive for a long time before touching it. Funny how something so small could carry enough truth to destroy an entire family. Harold's laptop remained exactly where he left it on the desk. Even now, seeing his reading glasses folded beside the keyboard made my chest ache in ways money and betrayal never could. I sat slowly in his leather chair and inserted the drive into the computer. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then a folder appeared on the screen labeled simply, "If necessary." My pulse slowed. Harold always named important things carefully. Inside were dozens of files organized by date. Bank statements, internal audits, transfer records, private emails. Every document arranged with the precision of a man who knew he might someday need to defend himself without being alive to speak. I opened the first spreadsheet and immediately recognized several offshore accounts connected to shell consulting firms. Zurich, Cayman Islands, Luxembourg. Millions of dollars transferred in carefully broken amounts over nearly 18 months. Not enough individually to trigger immediate alarms. But together, the numbers became staggering. My eyes moved slowly across the screen while a terrible understanding settled deeper inside me. Vanessa had not acted impulsively. This was not greed born from grief. This had been planned long before Harold died. One email folder contained private correspondence between Vanessa and a financial advisor named Gregory Mills. The messages were formal but coldly strategic. Discussions about future restructuring opportunities, accelerated inheritance positioning, potential board vulnerability after transition. Transition again. Always transition. Never death. Never family. Just opportunity disguised as sophistication. Then I found something worse. A scanned authorization form bearing Daniel's signature. My son had approved one of the transfers personally 6 months earlier. I leaned back slowly in Harold's chair and closed my eyes for a moment. Somehow, seeing Daniel's name hurt more than anything Vanessa had done. Betrayal from strangers feels sharp. Betrayal from your child feels hollow, like discovering a room inside yourself has been quietly emptied while you were still living in it. A soft knock startled me before the study door opened slightly. Sophie stepped inside carrying 2 cups of tea. "I saw your light on," she whispered. I quickly minimized the files on the screen, though part of me already suspected Sophie understood more than anyone realized. She placed 1 cup beside me carefully before glancing toward the laptop. "You found something, did you not?" she asked quietly. I studied her face for a long moment. Harold's instincts had trusted her for a reason. "Your grandfather was investigating financial theft before he died," I answered carefully. Sophie lowered herself into the chair across from me without speaking. She looked older tonight somehow, less like a college student, more like someone standing too close to adult disappointment too early in life. "Dad changed after he married Vanessa," she said finally. "At first it was small things. He stopped visiting Grandpa at the office as much. Then he started talking differently about money, like everything had a price attached to it." I stared at the rain moving down the windows behind her. "Your father used to be kind," I whispered. Sophie nodded sadly. "I think he still wants to be." The distinction hurt more than accusation would have. My eyes drifted back toward the laptop screen glowing softly in the dark study. File after file waited silently beneath Harold's careful organization. Proof. Evidence. Insurance against the very people he once hoped to protect. Then another folder caught my attention near the bottom of the screen. Restricted access protocol. My fingers moved slowly across the keyboard as I opened it. Inside was a single video file recorded only 8 days before Harold died. My hands remained still on the keyboard for several seconds before I finally clicked the video file open. The screen flickered once. Then Harold appeared sitting exactly where I was now, inside his study beneath the soft yellow glow of the desk lamp. He looked older than I remembered from only a week earlier, tired around the eyes, thinner through the shoulders. But his voice remained calm and steady, the same voice that once reassured investors during market crashes and comforted Sophie after childhood nightmares. "If this recording is being watched," he began quietly, then events unfolded exactly as I feared they might. Sophie sat silently beside me while rain whispered softly against the windows outside. Harold adjusted his glasses slightly before continuing. "Evelyn, I know this will be difficult to hear, but I need you to understand something clearly. Vanessa has been stealing from the company for over a year. At first I believed Daniel was unaware. I wanted desperately to believe that." My chest tightened painfully at the sound of my son's name. Harold looked directly into the camera then, and for a moment it felt as though he were speaking across time itself. Unfortunately, I was wrong. Sophie lowered her eyes immediately. I could hear the faint clinking of china downstairs where staff prepared breakfast, while my entire understanding of my family quietly collapsed upstairs above them. Harold continued speaking calmly, almost gently. Daniel did not organize the transfers. Vanessa manipulated most of the structure herself through offshore consultants and shell accounts. But eventually Daniel discovered enough to stop her. Instead, he chose to protect her. I closed my eyes briefly. Some part of me had already known. Mothers always know eventually. We simply spend years hoping we are mistaken. On the screen, Harold leaned back slightly in his chair. I confronted Daniel privately 3 months ago. He cried. He apologized. He promised he would fix everything. Harold paused for several seconds before speaking again. The next morning, Vanessa attempted to move another $400,000 through a Zurich account. The silence inside the study became unbearable after that. Not dramatic, not explosive, just heavy enough to settle into your bones permanently. Harold removed his glasses slowly and folded them in his hands. People often think greed begins with money, he said quietly. It does not. Greed begins the moment someone believes they deserve what another person spent a lifetime building. Sophie wiped at her eyes quickly beside me. Embarrassed by tears she was trying hard not to show. I reached over and gently covered her hand with mine. On the screen, Harold looked suddenly older than I had ever seen him. Evelyn, if you are watching this, then I am gone, and Vanessa will likely attempt to isolate you from the company and this house as quickly as possible. She believes control comes from access. She is wrong. He opened a folder beside him and held up a single document toward the camera. The trust cannot be activated without your authorization. Every controlling share tied to Carter Biotech remains frozen unless you personally release them. Martin knows the procedure. My breathing slowed carefully. So that was the real reason Vanessa seemed increasingly desperate. Not grief. Not transition. Delay. She could not access what she thought already belonged to her. Harold placed the document back onto the desk before speaking one final time. I am sorry I left you to carry this burden alone. But I also know something Vanessa does not understand. For the first time in the video, a faint smile touched his face. She believes kindness makes people weak. That mistake will cost her everything. The recording ended abruptly after that. The screen went dark, reflecting only the study around us and my own pale expression staring back from the laptop. Downstairs, I suddenly heard Vanessa laughing softly somewhere near the kitchen. Smooth. Confident. Certain she was already winning. Sophie looked toward me nervously. Grandma, she whispered. What are you going to do? I stared at the black computer screen for a long moment before answering. Then, very carefully, I closed Harold's laptop and stood from the desk. Exactly what your grandfather expected me to do, I said quietly. I am going to let them keep underestimating me. The following week, Vanessa became almost cheerful. That frightened me more than anger would have. People become careful when they are losing. They become relaxed when they believe victory is already guaranteed. Every morning, she moved through the estate with growing confidence, speaking openly about renovations, restructuring, and future plans as though Harold's absence had simply cleared space for her ambitions. One afternoon, I walked into the library and found fabric samples spread across the coffee table beside architectural sketches for remodeling the East Wing. I thought lighter colors would modernize the space. Vanessa explained casually when she noticed me looking at them. The house feels very traditional right now. Traditional. Another elegant word for inconvenient history. I smiled faintly and continued pouring tea without commenting. That unsettled her more than resistance would have. By then, Martin and I had already begun preparing quietly behind the scenes. 3 separate forensic accountants were reviewing the files from Harold's flash drive. Offshore transfers had been traced through consulting accounts connected to Vanessa's private business network. More importantly, the legal structure Harold established before his death remained untouched exactly as intended. Every controlling share of Carter Biotech remained frozen inside the trust. Vanessa and Daniel believed probate delays were merely procedural. They still had no idea nothing could move without my signature. And I had no intention of signing anything. 2 nights later, Vanessa hosted another dinner at the estate. This time, several board members attended alongside financial advisors and family attorneys. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath chandelier light, while quiet jazz drifted through hidden speakers in the dining room ceiling. To anyone observing from outside, we probably looked like a successful family handling tragedy with dignity and grace. Wealth teaches people how to disguise decay beautifully. During dessert, Richard Ellison finally cleared his throat and addressed the table carefully. There has been concern among shareholders regarding executive continuity, he said diplomatically. Naturally, everyone wants reassurance about leadership moving forward. Vanessa placed her fork down with elegant calm before Daniel could answer. Stability is our priority as well, she said smoothly. Daniel and I have already discussed several strategic transitions internally. Daniel nodded beside her, though he avoided looking directly at me while doing it. Strategic transitions. It amazed me how quickly people transformed a dead man's entire life into corporate language. Sophie sat quietly near the far end of the table, pushing food around her plate without eating much. I noticed she kept glancing toward me every few minutes, waiting perhaps for some visible reaction. But Harold understood something important before he died. Silence unsettles dishonest people because they cannot predict what exists inside it. Vanessa continued speaking confidently to the guests around her. Once the estate paperwork clears, we expect a very smooth restructuring process. Then she smiled at me directly. Evelyn has been incredibly cooperative during this difficult time. Several guests nodded politely. I lifted my teacup slowly. I have learned patience can be very valuable, I replied calmly. Vanessa held my gaze 1 second too long after that. Somewhere beneath her confidence, instinct had finally begun whispering warnings she could not fully explain yet. Later that evening, after the guests departed, I passed the downstairs study and heard voices through the partially closed door. Daniel sounded tense. "Why are you pushing so fast?" he asked quietly. Vanessa's answer came immediately. "Because delays create risk. Mom has not fought us once," Daniel replied. "Maybe we should slow down." There was a brief silence before Vanessa spoke again, her voice colder now. "That is exactly what worries me." I remained perfectly still outside the doorway. "Harold never trusted passive people," she continued quietly. "And your mother is being entirely too calm." I almost smiled hearing that. Finally, after weeks of treating me like fragile furniture left behind after a funeral, Vanessa had started understanding something dangerous. Grief had not weakened me. It had simply removed my patience for pretending. The official estate meeting was scheduled for the following Monday at Martin Hale's law office in downtown Hartford. Vanessa spent the entire weekend preparing as though she were attending a corporate acquisition instead of settling the affairs of a dead family member. Garment bags arrived from boutiques in New York. Daniel took phone calls late into the night behind closed doors. Even the atmosphere inside the estate shifted again, tighter now, filled with the nervous energy people carry before believing their lives are about to improve permanently. Monday morning arrived cold and bright after nearly 2 weeks of rain. Sunlight reflected sharply off the windows of Martin's office building, while traffic moved slowly below us through downtown streets lined with old brick architecture and polished financial towers. I wore a navy wool suit Harold once said made me look impossible to intimidate. Vanessa noticed it immediately the moment I entered the conference room. Her eyes narrowed almost invisibly before she smiled. "You look wonderful today, Evelyn," she said warmly. "Harold always loved that color on you." Compliments from manipulative people always arrive carrying hidden measurements beneath them. Daniel stood beside the conference table flipping nervously through paperwork, while 2 additional attorneys organized folders near the windows. Richard Ellison sat quietly at the far end of the room, avoiding direct eye contact with anyone. Sophie remained beside me in silence, calm but alert. Martin entered precisely at 10 o'clock, carrying several sealed binders. The room quieted immediately. "Thank you all for coming," he began professionally while taking his seat. "Today we will review the final estate structure established by Harold Carter prior to his passing." Vanessa folded her hands gracefully atop the conference table, every movement polished and patient. She believed this was the final formality standing between her and complete control. Martin opened the first binder slowly. The Carter estate contains multiple divisions including real property holdings, investment portfolios, charitable foundations, and controlling corporate shares tied to Carter Biotech. Daniel nodded stiffly beside Vanessa. Neither of them noticed Martin sliding a separate black folder quietly toward me across the table. As previously disclosed, Martin continued, certain assets were transferred into a protected trust structure approximately 6 months before Mr. Carter's death. Vanessa finally leaned forward slightly. There it was. The real subject. Under the trust provisions, Martin said carefully, all controlling shares remain frozen pending authorization from the primary trustee. Daniel frowned immediately. Primary trustee. Martin adjusted his glasses calmly. Evelyn Carter. Silence spread across the conference room so quickly it almost felt physical. Vanessa's expression did not fully collapse at first. It simply froze, like someone hearing unexpected thunder in the distance while still pretending the sky is clear. I do not understand, she said slowly. Daniel is Harold's direct heir. For personal assets, partially, Martin replied. Corporate control is separate. Daniel looked toward me then, confused and increasingly pale. Mom, I met my son's eyes quietly. Your father made his decisions very carefully. Vanessa recovered quickly, though tension now sharpened every word she spoke. Surely this is temporary until probate concludes. Martin opened another document. Actually, no. He paused deliberately before continuing. There is an additional protection clause attached to the trust. The room became perfectly still again. If any beneficiary attempts coercion, unauthorized financial restructuring, or efforts to remove Evelyn Carter from the family estate prior to trust activation, all inheritance rights tied to controlling shares are permanently revoked. Daniel stared blankly at Martin as if he had misheard him. Vanessa's face lost color for the first time since Harold died. That is absurd, she said sharply. There must be some mistake. Martin calmly opened another file. There is no mistake. Furthermore, forensic accountants have already confirmed unauthorized offshore transfers connected to shell consulting firms operated under your supervision, Mrs. Carter. No one moved after that. Not immediately. The city outside the windows continued normally, while inside the conference room an entire illusion finally cracked open. Daniel slowly turned toward Vanessa, genuine horror spreading across his face as understanding caught up with him piece by piece. You told me everything was legal, he whispered. Vanessa said nothing. For the first time since I met her, she had no immediate answer prepared. I sat quietly at the end of the table watching sunlight spill across Harold's signed documents while silence settled heavily over every expensive suit and polished lie in the room. Then Martin slid one final document toward me. Mrs. Carter, he said gently, the trust is awaiting your decision. The drive back to the estate felt strangely quiet after the meeting ended. No one argued. No one raised their voice. Real collapse rarely sounds dramatic in wealthy families. It happens softly, beneath polished manners and expensive silence. Daniel sat beside Vanessa in the back seat without speaking while the city faded behind us through cold afternoon sunlight. I watched reflections slide across the car windows and realized grief had finally changed shape inside me. Harold was still gone. Nothing would ever soften that absence. But now another loss sat beside it quietly. The loss of the son I thought I had raised. When we arrived home, Vanessa disappeared upstairs almost immediately without removing her coat. Daniel lingered near the foyer looking smaller than I had ever seen him. Not younger. Smaller. Like guilt had physically reduced him somehow. Martha opened the front door for us with nervous eyes, clearly aware something catastrophic had happened downtown. News travels quickly through houses where people depend on emotional weather for survival. I handed her my gloves calmly. Would you please make tea for Sophie and me in the sunroom? Martha nodded gratefully, relieved to receive ordinary instructions again. Ordinary things comfort frightened people. Daniel remained standing near the staircase while I removed my coat slowly. Mom, he finally said quietly. I looked at him, but did not answer immediately. He swallowed hard before continuing. I did not know how far things had gone. The sentence hung heavily between us. Not an apology. Not really. Just exhaustion finally colliding with truth. Your father warned you, I replied softly. Daniel looked down at the marble floor. I thought Vanessa was trying to help us build something bigger. I almost smiled at the tragedy inside that sentence. Men like Harold spent lifetimes building stability slowly, carefully, brick by brick. People like Vanessa convinced others that speed itself was intelligence. And now, I asked quietly. Daniel's eyes looked older when he finally met mine again. Now I think she wanted to win something that was never hers. Upstairs, a door closed sharply somewhere along the second-floor hallway. Vanessa was packing already. Sensible. By evening, Martin informed us that federal investigators had formally requested access to the financial records connected to the offshore accounts. Richard Ellison resigned from the board before sunset. Two additional executives immediately distanced themselves from Vanessa's consulting network. The world wealthy people build around themselves always appears permanent until consequences arrive. Then loyalty disappears faster than champagne at a charity gala. Later that night, I found Sophie curled beneath a blanket in the sunroom reading one of Harold's old history books beside the fireplace. She looked up quietly when I entered. "Is it over?" she asked softly. I sat beside her and stared out toward the dark lawn beyond the windows. The rain had finally stopped for the first time in weeks. "No," I answered honestly. "But the pretending is." Sophie rested her head gently against my shoulder after that, and for the first time since Harold died, the silence beside me felt comforting instead of empty. Upstairs, I heard footsteps moving back and forth through the hallway for nearly an hour. Suitcases opening, closet doors shutting. By midnight, Vanessa came downstairs carrying two large designer bags while Daniel stood near the front door looking hollow and exhausted. She paused briefly when she saw me sitting in the darkened living room beside the fireplace. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The woman who once moved through my home like a future queen now looked pale beneath the soft lamplight, though pride still held her posture perfectly straight. "You planned this," she said finally. Her voice sounded calm, but something underneath it had cracked permanently. I folded Harold's reading glasses carefully in my hands before answering. "No," I replied quietly. "Harold did." Vanessa stared at me a moment longer as though searching for anger she could fight against. But there was none left. Only clarity. Eventually, she turned and walked toward the door without another word. Daniel hesitated before following her. For one brief second, he looked back at me with the same lost expression he wore as a little boy after waking from nightmares. But childhood ends eventually, even for mothers. The front door closed softly behind them. I sat alone afterward, listening to the silence settle through the estate again while moonlight spilled faintly across Harold's empty chair beside the fireplace. He was right in the end. Grief did not destroy this family. It simply revealed who everyone truly was.